In a quiet and wind-brushed military cemetery at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, west of Boston, rows of white stones mark the final resting places of prisoners of war. Men who once served Italy and Germany, fought under a different flag, and ultimately died far from the countries they called home. Among these markers stands one gravestone that draws particular attention: the stone of U-boat Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Steinhoff. He died at the age of 37 in post-war American custody, under circumstances that would later provoke deep questions and troubling uncertainties. His final days were clouded by unexplained injuries and contradictions in official accounts, layers of mystery that remain unresolved nearly a century later. Far from Massachusetts, in the serene openness of the New Mexico desert, lies another grave, this one belonging to Friedrich's brother, Dr. Ernst Steinhoff. Though the brothers shared the same upbringing and inherited the same streak of ambition, their legacies could not be more different. Ernst was celebrated for his pioneering contributions to rocket guidance engineering. Working alongside Wernher von Braun, he became part of America's early missile and space programs. His achievements ultimately led to his induction into the International Space Hall of Fame. Yet Ernst's past in National Socialist Germany would eventually raise complex ethical questions about the price of scientific progress and the moral compromises that fuel great technological leaps.
During World War II, both brothers, one under the waves, one reaching toward the stars, used their talents against the Allies. Their worlds were different, but their objectives aligned with the ambitions of Nazi Germany: to weaken, disrupt, and ultimately destroy those who resisted the regime. The German Navy launched unrestricted submarine warfare across the Atlantic, a campaign that brought Britain to the brink and reshaped the strategies of navies worldwide. Ernst Steinhoff entered the world on February 11, 1908, in the town of Theide, Germany. His younger brother, Friedrich, was born a year later on July 14, 1909, in Kusel. As boys, both brothers showed early signs of the abilities that would later define their lives, yet they pursued vastly different passions. Ernst gravitated toward the sky. As a teenager, he immersed himself deeply in the study of flight, particularly the art of gliding, an elegant, demanding discipline that requires mastery of air currents and acute sensory awareness. In 1923, Ernst joined school friends in Kassel, forming a group of glider enthusiasts who spent weekends experimenting with the limits of air resistance and lift. Gliders, unlike powered aircraft, rely entirely on gravity, altitude, and invisible columns of rising warm air. Pilots must read the sky like a map and make decisions with precision, planning every glide, turn, and descent. Ernst quickly became a skilled and dedicated pilot, revealing not only a technical mind, but also the calm, calculated temperament needed to navigate the sky without an engine. When Adolf Hitler became chancellor in 1933, Germany's aviation landscape changed dramatically. Glider clubs, flying schools, and aviation institutions were absorbed into the structure of the Nazi state. What had been sporting and scientific communities soon fell under the supervision of the Luftwaffe and the broader apparatus of National Socialist ideology. Flight, especially gliding, became an important training ground for young Germans entering future military aviation roles. Ernst already excelled in the field. In 1935, he set a remarkable long-distance gliding record, flying approximately 500 kilometers from Breutz, Germany, to Braun in then Czechoslovakia. His abilities, combined with his growing academic knowledge, drew attention. Motivated by a fascination for the science of flight, Ernst pursued engineering at the Technical University of Darmstadt, one of Germany's leading institutions for aeronautics research. His work connected him to the Research Institute for Gliding, a center tied to the Luftwaffe's technical and research initiatives. There, he deepened his expertise in flight mechanics, aircraft instruments, and emerging control technologies. By the late 1930s, his path was merging toward one of the most ambitious engineering efforts of the 20th century. While Ernst looked upward, Friedrich chose the sea. Before joining the Navy, he served in the German Merchant Marine, gaining experience aboard ocean-going ships and earning a license that qualified him as a first officer. Yet with Germany rearming its forces in the 1930s and rebuilding its navy, the Kriegsmarine, Friedrich felt compelled to join. In 1935, he entered the naval ranks. His training progressed from junior command roles aboard frontline vessels to specialized officer courses in the Baltic, where he learned the technical and tactical demands of undersea warfare. Those who later served with him described him as a committed, responsible captain, caring toward younger sailors, protective of his crew, and respected for his knowledge of the sea. His wife Illa would later describe an unusual contradiction. Friedrich loved the open water, the vast horizons of the ocean, yet suffered from bouts of claustrophobia, a difficult trait for a man destined to command submarines. Despite this, in 1941, he entered the feared and celebrated U-boat service, a decision that placed him at the deadly heart of the Battle of the Atlantic.
Within the Nazi state, U-boat commanders were depicted as bold heroes, pushing the limits of endurance beneath the waves. To the Allies, they were lethal threats, wolves in steel hulls hunting the lifelines that kept Britain supplied with food, weapons, and industrial goods. The Battle of the Atlantic became the longest continuous campaign of the war, and U-boat officers like Steinhoff were instrumental figures within it. While Friedrich took to the sea, Ernst took a different oath, one of science in service of the Reich. In 1939, he was recruited by Wernher von Braun, the charismatic engineer and visionary behind Germany's nascent rocket program. Ernst arrived at Peenemünde, the newly constructed rocket research center on the Baltic Sea. The site, isolated by marshes and coastal dunes, was one of the most ambitious scientific facilities in Europe. There, aerodynamics, physics, chemistry, and military strategy converged to create technologies that had never existed before. Ernst had not yet completed his PhD, which focused on aircraft instrumentation, but von Braun saw in him a sharp intellect, meticulous approach, and strong alignment with the project's goals. Ernst fit quickly into the team of young, determined engineers driven by the dream of creating rockets that could travel farther and faster than any artillery. He became central in developing guidance and control systems, the complex technologies that would determine whether a rocket could fly in a predictable arc and strike its intended target. Peenemünde did not emerge overnight. Its origins trace back to the early 1930s when German strategists began imagining weapons that could bypass the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, evade traditional defenses, and strike deep inside enemy territory. Long-range missiles were seen not only as tools of war, but as instruments of terror, devices meant to demoralize civilian populations and cripple the enemy's resolve. These early concepts formed the backbone of what would later become the V-weapons program. Under von Braun's leadership, Ernst and other engineers worked on transforming theoretical rocket designs into functioning machines. The V-2, the most advanced missile of its time, was a liquid-fueled rocket capable of reaching the edge of space before descending toward its target at supersonic speeds. Ernst's role grew rapidly. He became the director of flight mechanics, ballistics, guidance, control, and instrumentation, a critical position that made him responsible for the rocket's brain. Guiding a missile was exceptionally difficult. At launch, the V-2 shot upward vertically. To reach distant cities like London, it had to tilt into a precise trajectory, fly as a ballistic missile, and fall toward the target. Inside the nose of the rocket, gyroscopes, accelerometers, and other instruments measured orientation, acceleration, and velocity. These instruments transmitted signals to adjust movable fins and vanes that kept the missile on course. In the early 1940s, such technology was unprecedented. Fragile, temperamental, and prone to catastrophic failure under extreme forces. During these years, an unusual idea took shape in private conversation. At a family gathering, Friedrich and Ernst, one a U-boat captain, the other a rocket engineer, discussed their respective worlds. Naturally, the question arose, could rockets be launched from submarines? The idea was simple but revolutionary. A submerged craft firing missiles covertly, capable of striking coastal targets without warning. The brothers shared the concept with their commanding officers. Funding was approved, and they carried out an experimental test using off-the-shelf Army rockets mounted on the deck of U-511. On June 4, 1942, 40 feet below the surface near Peenemünde, the submarine fired these rockets and succeeded. It proved that submarine-launched rocketry was possible more than a decade before superpowers would attempt the same concept. However, the rockets used in this trial had a range of only about 5 kilometers. From a military perspective, this limited their usefulness. A submarine would have to surface or approach dangerously close to shore. As a result, the Kriegsmarine dismissed the concept, at least temporarily. But the experiment planted the first seeds of what would eventually become submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, one of the defining weapons systems of the Cold War. While Friedrich returned to the sea, Ernst pushed ahead with the rocket program. The early A-series tests were riddled with disasters. Rockets exploded, fell apart mid-air, or veered off course. Engineers worked through sleepless nights, refining fuel mixtures, redesigning control surfaces, and recalibrating instruments. Then came the breakthrough. On October 3, 1942, the third launch attempt of the A-4, later called the V-2, succeeded spectacularly. The rocket accelerated to more than 4 times the speed of sound, rose to about 90 kilometers, near the boundary of space, and traveled roughly 190 kilometers. It marked the first time in human history that a man-made object traveled into the fringes of outer space. This achievement provided not only scientific validation, but also political leverage. Von Braun, General Walter Dornberger, and Ernst Steinhoff prepared a formal presentation for Adolf Hitler. In July 1943, the 3 men flew to East Prussia, where Hitler's headquarters stood surrounded by dense forests and guarded secrecy. They waited for 8 hours. Hitler's daily schedule often shifted without explanation. Meetings could be delayed indefinitely. Finally, the Führer entered with senior generals and top officials. Dornberger introduced von Braun, who narrated a film documenting the October test launch. The footage spoke for itself. A sleek rocket rising from a plume of fire, arching into the sky and disappearing into the stratosphere. Hitler was mesmerized. He approved extensive funding and ordered mass production of up to 2,000 A-4 rockets per month. Yet even as Hitler embraced the program, the British took notice. In June 1943, RAF reconnaissance photographs identified unusual activity at Peenemünde. 2 months later, in August, the RAF launched a devastating bombing raid that forced much of the V-2 program underground. Ernst's daughter Monica later recalled memories of seeing glowing trails across the night sky, likened to Christmas trees falling from above. As a child, she saw beauty in what was actually the terrifying glow of flares dropped before bombing runs. With Peenemünde vulnerable, production moved into underground tunnels at sites like Mittelbau Dora. Conditions there were horrifying. Cramped, airless tunnels, brutal overseers, starvation, disease, and constant fatigue. Historians estimate 1/3 of the roughly 60,000 forced laborers in the Dora system perished. More prisoners died constructing the V-2 than the missile ever killed in wartime deployment, a grim reminder of the human cost buried beneath technological innovation. Engineers at Peenemünde, including von Braun and Ernst, were aware of these conditions. Some later claimed limited involvement. However, contemporary evidence and testimony reveal a more complex and troubling picture. According to historian Michael Neufeld, the prisoners were only factors of production, viewed as expendable labor in pursuit of scientific goals. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence operations intensified. In 1944, a German spy landed on the American coast, was captured and interrogated. He spoke of imminent rocket attacks against the United States, provoking fear and speculation. Reports circulated that Germany might be attempting to mount V-2 rockets onto submarines. By October 1944, the FBI relayed these concerns to J. Edgar Hoover, and New York's mayor warned citizens of potential rocket strikes. Intercepted communications in March 1945 mentioned long-range U-boats approaching American shores. One message noted that Captain Friedrich Steinhoff had participated in early submarine rocket experiments, fueling American fears. These warnings triggered Operation Teardrop, a naval operation aimed at hunting and intercepting U-boats believed to be carrying missile systems toward the U.S. coast.
As the war in Europe neared its end, chaos engulfed Germany. The Soviet army advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. Cities lay in ruins. Food was scarce. Communications were collapsing. Amid this collapse, Winston Churchill wrote later of the immense danger posed by U-boats, although some of his warnings were embellished in post-war publications. The war in Europe formally ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. Yet for thousands of men still scattered across oceans, bunkers, and military installations, the war's official end did not immediately bring safety, dignity, or clear explanations. Among them were the surviving crews of the U-boats, who now faced orders to surface, display signals of surrender, and place themselves at the mercy of the Allies. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had briefly succeeded Hitler as Germany's head of state, radioed all remaining U-boats on May 4th with explicit instructions. They were to cease all hostilities, surface, identify themselves with a black flag, and contact the nearest Allied authority. This black flag caused some bitterness among veteran captains. Traditionally associated with piracy, it felt to many like a mark of shame, especially for those who saw themselves not as criminals, but as soldiers following duty. In reality, Allied planners had chosen black for simple visibility, a stark, unmistakable signal on the gray horizon. Dönitz instructed crews to destroy encryption devices, jettison codebooks and cipher materials, including the famed Enigma machines, and secure their vessels in a non-threatening configuration. Anti-aircraft ammunition was to be discarded. Deck guns were to be pointed away from potential targets. The message was clear: compliance, or else Allied forces would treat any resisting submarine as hostile and sink it. One by one, U-boats surfaced and surrendered. Allied naval squadrons escorted them to ports such as Loch Eriboll in Scotland, Lissahalli in Northern Ireland, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Among them was U-873, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Steinhoff. After surrendering on May 17, 1945, Steinhoff and his 59-man crew were transported to the Portsmouth Naval Prison near Kittery, Maine, an imposing granite institution known for tight confinement and harsh conditions. What followed inside those walls remains one of the most troubling and contested episodes in the aftermath of the U-boat war.
After initial processing, Steinhoff and several of his officers were transferred by bus to the Charles Street Jail in Boston, where interrogations intensified. American naval intelligence officers were particularly interested in Friedrich for several reasons. They knew, through captured documents, decrypted signals, and earlier intelligence briefings that he had commanded U-511, the submarine involved in the very first underwater rocket launch experiments at Peenemünde. They also believed he might possess knowledge of potential long-range submarine-based missile systems, technology which they feared Germany might have been preparing to use against the United States in the war's final months. As interrogations progressed, multiple witnesses reported disturbing observations. Fellow prisoners later recounted that Steinhoff returned to his cell on more than one occasion with severe swelling, bruising, and signs of recent physical trauma. His face was discolored, marked with contusions suggestive of repeated blows. Although no official records explicitly admit to physical mistreatment, the accounts of those who saw him describe a man whose condition deteriorated dramatically during questioning. Commander Johann Heinrich Fehler, captain of U-234, imprisoned in a nearby cell, spoke after the war about unsettling noises during the nights. Thuds, raised voices, and what he interpreted as sounds of struggle. Fehler said he could not sleep because of what he believed were the sounds of Steinhoff's violent treatment. Around dawn, a disturbance swept through the cell block. Guards rushing, a stretcher clattering, and the grim announcement that Steinhoff had been found unconscious in a pool of blood. The official story released later claimed suicide. According to the report, Steinhoff allegedly used a sharpened object or a broken implement to inflict a fatal wound on himself. The combination of physical injuries, contradictory explanations, witness testimony of beatings, and the timing of his death while under interrogation strongly suggested that Steinhoff died as a result of mistreatment, whether intentional or through fatal negligence. While Friedrich met a tragic and violent end, another story was unfolding thousands of kilometers away. Ernst Steinhoff, along with von Braun and other Peenemünde engineers, understood that the approaching Soviet forces posed a different kind of danger. They knew that the Soviet Union aimed not just to seize technology, but also to detain the scientists themselves, often through forced cooperation or punitive measures. To avoid capture, Peenemunde's leadership began hiding documents, burying sensitive materials, and dispersing equipment. Then they fled westward toward Bavaria, seeking to surrender to American forces. The Allies, particularly the United States, now saw another dimension to the rocket program. The V-2 may have failed strategically, it did not change the war's outcome, but technologically it was a leap into the future. It demonstrated the feasibility of long-range ballistic missiles. It proved that liquid propellant engines could reach the edge of space. It revealed that guidance and control systems could steer a multi-ton vehicle at supersonic speeds. And it showed that rocketry was no longer a fringe experiment. It was the next frontier of global power. This realization triggered one of the most intense scientific competitions in history. Operation Paperclip began as a covert effort to recruit German scientists before the Soviet Union could seize them. The Americans understood that the geopolitical balance of the post-war world and the coming ideological conflict with the Soviet Union would depend heavily on advanced weaponry and aerospace capabilities. German scientists, regardless of their political affiliations, represented a treasure trove of expertise. Von Braun, Dornberger, and Ernst Steinhoff and dozens of other scientists surrendered to American troops in Austria and Bavaria. They were quickly interrogated, screened, and eventually approved for transport to the United States. Some were quietly cleaned of their Nazi affiliations in official documents to make their transfer more acceptable to American institutions and the public. The Soviets, meanwhile, captured what they could: facilities, launch pads, spare parts, and some middle-level engineers. But the heart of the rocket program, the core leadership, had already chosen the Americans. In the summer of 1945, the first group of German rocket engineers boarded military transport ships bound for the United States. Others followed over the next 2 years, resulting in a community of more than 300 scientists and technicians working in American research centers, from White Sands in New Mexico to Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. Their arrival marked the beginning of a transformation in U.S. missile development.
Each launch marked a historic step in America's transition into the missile age, an era that would eventually lead to the creation of intercontinental ballistic missiles and the dawn of human spaceflight. Yet the morality of Operation Paperclip stirred intense debate in the United States. In 1946, Albert Einstein, along with other prominent scientists, publicly criticized the government for granting asylum and employment to men who had worked for the Nazi state. They feared that accepting such individuals sent a dangerous message, compromising America's moral standing and risking ideological infiltration.
But the military says they
Nevertheless,
are vital for national
the U.S.
security.
military argued that the Cold War demanded the best minds available, regardless of their past allegiances. And thus, while Friedrich lay in an American military cemetery, Ernst lived as a valued scientific asset, receiving housing, security, and eventually professional honor.